Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving straight into a pretty fascinating paradox hiding right in plain sight. We are going to explore exactly why society is overwhelmingly stuck at the bottom of the cognitive pyramid, and shockingly, what happens to the rare minds that actually manage to reach the top. Because as it turns out, reaching the absolute peak of human thought isn't always the amazing gift we've been told it is. In fact, it can become a really profound trap.
I mean, think about it. We literally have the entire sum of human history, philosophy, and science sitting right in our pockets. Yet, society just seems completely paralyzed. Everywhere you look, especially online, we're drowning in these surface-level reactions and just regurgitating other people's opinions. We've totally confused having access to information with actually possessing genuine depth. So why exactly have we forgotten how to think for ourselves?
Well, back in 1956, a guy named Benjamin Bloom created a 6-step taxonomy to map out exactly how we learn. It basically functions like a mental pyramid. At the very bottom, you've just got remembering, literally just repeating what you're told. Then you move up through understanding and applying, but the real magic happens at the higher levels, analyzing, evaluating, and finally the absolute peak, which is creating entirely new ideas. The real tragedy of modern society is that most people never, ever climb past step 1 or 2.
So why are we stuck there? Biologically, it comes down to something called cognitive miserliness. Our brains are literally hardwired for it. Evolution designed our minds to survive, and survival means conserving as much energy as possible. Deep thought requires breaking old patterns and building new ones, and honestly, that demands a heavy metabolic cost. Your brain is naturally wired to avoid that effort unless it absolutely has to. To put that metabolic cost into perspective, just look at this number, 20%. Your brain only makes up about 2% of your total body weight, but it burns roughly 20% of your body's energy. When you actually sit down to analyze or evaluate complex ideas, your brain is doing something evolution never really optimized it for. It literally punishes you with a feeling of mental soreness and discomfort, which just makes you want to retreat to the easy, thoughtless comfort of those bottom steps.
But it's not just biology, right? There's another massive reason we stay stuck, and that's the gravity of our identity. People naturally tie their beliefs to their tribes. When an idea becomes part of who you are, you just stop evaluating it. You defend it. You prioritize emotion over cognition and belonging over truth. This completely collapses the cognitive pyramid because, frankly, fitting in with your tribe just feels a whole lot safer than asking the difficult questions required to actually think deeply.
Which brings us to Section 1, the metacognition trap, when awareness becomes a prison.
So what happens to the rare individuals who do effortlessly bypass cognitive miserliness and reach the top of the pyramid? You'd think it's pure freedom, right? Well, philosopher Alan Watts really hit the nail on the head here. He said, a person who thinks all the time has nothing to think about except thoughts. Instead of experiencing liberation, highly intelligent deep thinkers develop metacognition, the ability to constantly watch their own minds. But this can quickly become a prison. They get trapped endlessly observing the observer, analyzing their own thoughts until they completely lose touch with actual lived reality.
It really comes down to the difference between healthy reflection and toxic rumination. Healthy reflection moves you toward a resolution. You analyze a problem, you learn from it, and you move forward. But for the deep thinker, reflection mutates into toxic rumination. The mind becomes like a supercomputer stuck in an endless loop, spinning its wheels, dissecting every single awkward silence and every social misstep without ever actually reaching a satisfying conclusion.
This whole loop is powered by a brain system called the Default Mode Network, or DMN. Usually, it's just active when you're daydreaming or resting. But for deep thinkers, the DMN literally never shuts up. It becomes an overactive, nonstop loop of inward surveillance. And here's the really tricky part. This creates a weird addiction to insight. The brain feels super productive because it's endlessly mapping out your internal traumas and behavioral flaws, even when you aren't doing a single thing to actually change your life.
Moving on to Section 2, the former gifted child, the danger of early potential.
To understand why these brilliant minds freeze up in adulthood, we have to look at childhood, specifically under a very common label, the gifted child. Normal skill acquisition is all about habituated effort. You struggle, you fail, and you slowly grow. But the gifted child experiences innate intelligence. They grasp concepts instantly with absolutely zero resistance. Because they completely bypass the normal struggles of learning early on, their brains learn a really dangerous lesson, that effort is just metabolic waste. They simply never develop the gritty resilience of habituated effort.
And that creates this tragic burden of potential. Imagine growing up and society handing you a blueprint for an enormous complex mansion. Meanwhile, all your peers get blueprints for simple little shacks. As the years pass, your peers successfully build and live happily in those completed shacks. The gifted adult looks at their unfinished mansion foundation and feels immense temporal shame, this crippling fear that they are permanently falling behind, which just leads to a total paralysis of action.
So how do they cope with that paralysis? Well, they develop something called defensive arrogance. To shield their fragile, unpracticed egos from the messy friction of the real world, they completely reframe their social isolation. They tell themselves, hey, I'm not falling behind. Everyone else is just too simple to understand me. They literally use their isolation as proof of their intellectual superiority, just to avoid the pain of trying and failing.
This arrogance is totally powered by an endless mental loop. First, they use their massive intellect to perfectly simulate a social event or project right in their heads. Second, they predict all the negative outcomes and every little flaw. Third, they convince themselves that actually doing it is just a waste of time. And finally, they remain completely paralyzed. Their powerful intellect is hijacked by their own ego just to keep them safe from reality.
Which leads us to Section 3, Learning How to Struggle, Reclaiming the Ordinary.
Now, the situation is absolutely not hopeless, but the first, and honestly most painful step to break free is totally dismantling that gifted identity. You have to let go of the story that you are somehow exceptional. You really must accept that your high intelligence does not exempt you from the messy, uncomfortable, and sometimes totally humiliating work of being an ordinary human beginner.
You basically have to shift your entire operating system. You need to move away from performance, constantly performing for this hypothetical, perfect future where you finally live up to your massive potential. Instead, you have to embrace engagement. Ground yourself right here in the active, imperfect present moment. You have to learn to actually love the messy process itself, instead of just obsessing over a perfect outcome.
Practically speaking, this means you essentially have to go back in time. You must consciously build the developmental skills you skipped over when you were a kid. You've got to learn to tolerate frustration. You have to do the boring, totally repetitive work. You need to sit with the extreme discomfort of not knowing the answer instantly. And most importantly, you have to accept being really bad at things before you ever get good at them.
There's this amazing line from the Bhagavad Gita that captures the mental shift required here perfectly. You are entitled to the action, not the outcome. You literally have to divorce your self-worth from the praise of the final product. Just show up and do the work simply because doing the work is the point. The action itself is your life, not the round of applause at the very end.
Think about your mind like this. If your brain is a high-performance Ferrari, having the biggest, fastest engine in the world doesn't matter at all if you overheat the second you hit normal, everyday traffic. Healing isn't about upgrading the engine. It's about learning how to drive that incredibly powerful car patiently and steadily through the mundane, messy, stop-and-go traffic of the real world. Ultimately, the whole goal here is becoming ordinary. And becoming ordinary in a psychological sense isn't about settling for being mediocre. Not at all. It's about becoming resilient, becoming fully embodied in the present moment, and being capable of picking yourself back up after a very public failure. It's about doing the work, starting small, and finding the raw courage to just try again when things don't go perfectly. So, I want to leave you with a pretty provocative question. It's a choice that every deep thinker eventually has to make. Will you continue to safely simulate life inside the pristine, protected walls of your own mind? Or are you willing to trade that comfortable illusion of perfect potential, embrace the struggle, and finally begin to live? The choice is entirely yours. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.